Richard and Margaret Fletcher were beloved fixtures of their suburban neighborhood, the kind of couple everyone admired for their kindness and warmth. Their daughter, Emma, was seen as the perfect caregiver, devoting her life to their happiness. But behind the cheerful facade, Emma harbored a chilling secret, one so dark that when it finally unraveled, it left the entire community in shock. Emma Fletcher was the type of person you'd never expect to be at the center of a sinister story. Living in a quiet suburban neighborhood, she seemed to embody everything people admired in a daughter. At 28, she had devoted her life to caring for her aging parents, Richard and Margaret Fletcher. Her days were filled with errands, cooking meals, and tending to the well-manicured garden surrounding their modest home. Neighbors often remarked on her dedication, admiring how she seemed to have sacrificed her own ambitions to ensure her parents lived comfortably in their golden years. From the outside, the Fletcher family appeared idyllic. Richard, a retired civil servant, received a generous pension that allowed the family to live without financial strain. Margaret, a former schoolteacher, had accumulated a tidy nest egg, ensuring they never wanted for anything. The couple had raised Emma to value family above all else, and she took that lesson to heart, or so it seemed. Emma had never moved out, citing her parents' needs as the reason. She told neighbors and friends that she couldn't imagine leaving them alone in their twilight years, a statement that earned her both admiration and sympathy. Yet behind closed doors, Emma's life was far from perfect. While her devotion to her parents appeared selfless, it masked an unsettling reality. She had no job, no savings, and no prospects. Her entire existence depended on her parents' financial support, and though she maintained a cheery facade, the thought of losing that safety net consumed her. Emma's parents had often urged her to think about her future, to build a life of her own, but she brushed off their concerns. Quietly, Emma resented the pressure to change, viewing her parents as both providers and obstacles to the comfortable, consequence-free life she had grown accustomed to. For years, Emma managed to maintain the illusion of the perfect daughter. She joined her parents at church, greeted neighbors warmly, and even volunteered at local events, reinforcing her wholesome image. But as Richard and Margaret aged, their health began to decline, and with it, the stability of Emma's carefully constructed world. Richard's pension would cease upon his death, and Margaret's savings wouldn't last forever. Emma began to feel the walls closing in, the life she depended on slipping through her fingers. Neighbors noticed subtle changes over time. Emma, once eager to chat during her grocery runs, became more withdrawn. Richard and Margaret, who had once enjoyed leisurely strolls in the neighborhood, were rarely seen. When asked, Emma would smile and explain they were simply tired or enjoying quiet time indoors. Her explanations were plausible enough to satisfy casual inquiries, but a few neighbors found themselves wondering if everything was as it seemed. For Emma, the stakes were clear. She couldn't let her parents' deaths ruin her life. She began to think about how she could preserve the comfort and stability she had always known, even if it meant doing the unthinkable. What started as fleeting thoughts soon morphed into a calculated plan, one that would ultimately shock the community to its core. Months passed, and the absence of Richard and Margaret Fletcher became increasingly noticeable. In a neighborhood where people took pride in knowing each other's routines, their disappearance was hard to ignore. Richard, who had been a fixture on his morning walks, was no longer seen strolling the tree-lined streets. Margaret, who loved chatting with neighbors while tending to her flowers, had not been spotted in weeks. Emma Fletcher, however, carried on as if everything were normal. When questioned, Emma offered a series of explanations that were just believable enough to quell suspicion. She claimed her parents were taking time to relax, enjoying the solitude of their home. When pressed further, she revealed they had decided to embark on a long overdue vacation to celebrate their anniversary, a trip they had always dreamed of but never managed to take. She spoke with confidence and detail, even mentioning destinations they supposedly planned to visit. For most, her story seemed plausible. Despite her convincing demeanor, subtle cracks began to appear in Emma's facade. Richard's physician noted his unexplained absence from multiple medical appointments. The mailbox, once emptied regularly, now overflowed with letters and advertisements. Neighbors who had been close to the Fletchers grew uneasy. Mrs. Cartwright, the elderly woman who lived next door, had grown particularly concerned. She remembered how Richard and Margaret would often share stories about their travels in advance, yet there had been no mention of this supposed vacation before their sudden disappearance. Determined to allay concerns, Emma began a campaign of misdirection. She posted updates on social media, sharing old family photos as if they were new. She wrote captions about how her parents were enjoying their time away, marveling at the sights, and savoring the peace of their travels. To further sell the illusion, she forged postcards with vague messages purportedly written by Richard and Margaret describing their adventures. These postcards, strategically shared with skeptical neighbors, temporarily eased some doubts. However, the inconsistencies in Emma's narrative became harder to ignore. When asked about specific details of her parents' trip, she often contradicted herself. She claimed they were in Florida one day, only to mention a visit to a national park on the opposite side of the country the next. Her stories grew increasingly elaborate, but the more she tried to explain, the more suspicion grew. Mrs. Cartwright finally decided to confront Emma directly. When she asked why the Fletchers hadn't returned phone calls or sent emails, Emma responded with a forged letter, supposedly from Richard, explaining their decision to stay in Florida permanently. The letter was neatly written and filled with the kind of details designed to put any concerns to rest. But to Mrs. Cartwright, something felt off. Emma's deception was beginning to strain under its own weight. Each lie she told required another to sustain it, and the more she tried to keep the illusion intact, the closer she edged toward exposure. What she didn't know was that her unraveling story was about to attract the attention of someone who wouldn't be so easily convinced. The Fletcher home had always been a welcoming sight in the neighborhood, with its neatly trimmed lawn and flower beds blooming in vibrant colors. However, over time, a sense of unease began to surround the house. The once busy property seemed quieter than ever. Mail and packages accumulated on the porch, and curtains remained drawn throughout the day. The vibrant life that once characterized the home now felt absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made neighbors uneasy. One day, a postal worker delivering mail noticed an unusual odor wafting from the property. Initially dismissing it as a dead animal nearby, the worker carried on. But the smell persisted and grew stronger with time. Coupled with the unexplained absence of the elderly couple, it became impossible to ignore. The postal worker decided to report the issue, prompting the local police to conduct a welfare check. When officers arrived, Emma greeted them with an air of nervous politeness. She explained that her parents were still away, reiterating the story of their extended trip. Though her words seemed credible on the surface, her demeanor raised red flags. She appeared tense and avoided eye contact, her smile wavering under the scrutiny of their questions. The officers inspected the house, finding nothing immediately alarming. The living spaces were spotless, with everything meticulously arranged, but something about the house felt off. In the basement, they noticed fresh renovations, newly plastered and painted walls in an otherwise outdated space. When asked about it, Emma claimed she was in the process of modernizing the home as a surprise for her parents' return. Her explanation was plausible, yet her strained tone made the officers suspicious. Authorities decided to bring in cadaver dogs to search the property. Emma's initial composure crumbled as the dogs began their work, and she grew visibly agitated. Within minutes, the dogs alerted to the basement. Officers obtained a search warrant, and what they uncovered behind the pristine walls shocked everyone. Beneath the layers of plaster and paint were the bodies of Richard and Margaret Fletcher, entombed in their own home. The discovery was gruesome. Richard's body showed signs of poisoning, while Margaret's injuries suggested she had been struck with a blunt object. Both had been dead for months, their remains carefully concealed behind the newly constructed wall. The meticulous effort to hide their bodies revealed a chilling level of premeditation. Emma's carefully curated image of the devoted daughter unraveled in an instant. Investigators scoured the house for evidence, uncovering documents and receipts that hinted at her motives. A bottle of industrial-strength cleaner, bags of cement, and plastering tools were found in the garage. The discovery of her parents' financial records revealed something even more damning. Emma had continued to withdraw money from their accounts, paying bills, funding home renovations, and maintaining her lifestyle as if nothing had happened. The idyllic suburban home, once a symbol of family and community, had become the site of a horrifying crime. Emma's web of lies had finally collapsed, exposing the horrifying truth she had worked so hard to bury. The investigation into the murders of Richard and Margaret Fletcher quickly revealed a chilling story of greed and deceit. As forensic teams combed through the house, Emma Fletcher's carefully constructed life unraveled piece by piece. The autopsies provided grim details. Richard had been poisoned with a lethal cocktail of sedatives slipped into his evening tea. Margaret's death was far more violent. She had been struck multiple times with a blunt object, suggesting a desperate struggle before succumbing to her injuries. Investigators were shocked by the level of planning that went into Emma's crime. A search of her computer and phone uncovered a trove of incriminating evidence. Emma had spent months researching methods to kill without arousing suspicion, ways to conceal bodies, and how to forge legal documents. There were searches for how to simulate a natural death and tutorials on wall construction. Her digital footprint painted a picture of a calculated killer who left little to chance. Financial records revealed her motive in stark detail. Richard's pension provided a steady stream of income, which Emma had come to rely on entirely. Margaret's savings were another source of security, carefully managed to sustain their comfortable lifestyle. But with both parents aging and their health declining, Emma feared the inevitable loss of this financial support. Their deaths would mean the end of her comfortable existence, a reality she was unwilling to face. Further investigation exposed Emma's attempts to take full control of her parents' assets. She had forged documents granting her power of attorney, allowing her to access their bank accounts freely. She had even begun the process of transferring the family home into her name, using forged signatures to bypass legal requirements. Emma's plan was clear. By eliminating her parents and concealing their deaths, she could continue to live off their money indefinitely. The most chilling aspect of the case was Emma's demeanor. She showed no remorse or grief when confronted with the evidence. Interviews with neighbors and acquaintances revealed a pattern of manipulation. Emma had skillfully used her image as the devoted daughter to deflect suspicion, leveraging her parents' absence to craft a narrative of independence and care. She had gone so far as to send forged letters and postcards to reassure those who questioned her, a tactic that delayed discovery for months. The court proceedings revealed the full extent of Emma's deceit. Prosecutors described her as a cold and calculating individual who had murdered her own parents to preserve her lifestyle. They presented a timeline of events, showing how she had poisoned Richard first, likely to minimize resistance, before turning on Margaret in a more violent encounter. Emma's defense team attempted to portray her as a woman overwhelmed by financial pressure, but the jury was unmoved. Emma's chilling lack of emotion throughout the trial only deepened public fascination with the case. What drove a seemingly loving daughter to commit such heinous acts against her own family? The answer, as the evidence showed, was nothing more than greed and a desperate desire to maintain her privileged life. The courtroom buzzed with a mix of horror and disbelief as Emma's twisted scheme was laid bare for all to see. The trial of Emma Fletcher captivated the nation. What had initially seemed like a tragic case of elderly parents going missing had transformed into a shocking tale of murder, manipulation, and greed. Reporters flocked to the courthouse, capturing every twist and turn as the story unfolded. Emma, once the unassuming and devoted daughter, now stood exposed as a calculating killer. The prosecution meticulously laid out their case, presenting overwhelming evidence of Emma's guilt. They detailed her months of planning, pointing to the internet searches, forged documents, and financial transactions that highlighted her premeditated intent. Prosecutors argued that Emma's only motivation was financial gain. Richard's pension and Margaret's savings had provided her with a comfortable life, and she was determined to maintain it at any cost, even if it meant killing the very people who made it possible. Witnesses testified about Emma's behavior in the months leading up to her parents' deaths. Neighbors described her increasingly withdrawn demeanor, her vague explanations for her parents' absence, and her strained attempts to maintain a sense of normalcy. Friends who had once admired her devotion now saw those actions in a sinister light, questioning whether her care for her parents had always been genuine or merely part of her facade. Emma's defense team attempted to humanize her, portraying her as a woman crushed by financial pressure and the burden of caregiving. They argued that her actions, while reprehensible, stemmed from desperation rather than malice. They painted a picture of a lonely individual with no outside support, trapped in a situation that spiraled out of control. However, this narrative faltered under the weight of evidence. Emma's calculated efforts to conceal the crime, constructing a wall, forging letters, and maintaining access to her parents' accounts, left no doubt that her actions were deliberate. Throughout the trial, Emma's demeanor became a focal point. She displayed little emotion, sitting stone-faced as prosecutors described the gruesome details of her parents' deaths. Her lack of remorse unsettled everyone in the courtroom, from the jury to the spectators. Psychologists called by the prosecution described her as having a chilling detachment, suggesting that her actions were driven purely by self-interest. The jury deliberated for just 2 days before delivering their verdict: guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, fraud, and the concealment of human remains. Emma was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her sentencing hearing brought no closure to those who had once trusted her. Neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives expressed disbelief that someone they had known for years could commit such a heinous act. After the trial, the Fletcher home was left vacant, a haunting reminder of the crimes committed within its walls. Rumors swirled about its future, with some suggesting it should be demolished to erase the dark memories associated with it. The story of Emma Fletcher remains a cautionary tale about the lengths some will go to protect their comforts and the darkness that can hide behind a facade of normalcy. For those who followed the case, one question lingered. Was Emma always capable of such evil, or had desperation twisted her into something unrecognizable? The answer may never be known, but the legacy of her actions ensures she will not be forgotten.